Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be looking at my top 10 albums of the 1990s. So a few weeks ago I did my top albums of the 2000s, and between now and Christmas I'm going to be going right back through the decades as far as the 60s before looking at the top 10 albums of this decade. But today it's the 90s. So the 1990s were a massive decade for me musically. I was hugely into Britpop, but this top 10 covers so much more than that, as you'll see in my first selection. From 1991, it's Automatic for the People by R.E.M. This is an album that's just absolutely packed full of great songs, and I think this lifted them to be one of the biggest bands in the world, and them and U2 were sort of fighting it out for quite a while during the early 90s, I think, for that particular title. You've got the obvious hit like Everybody Hurts on here, but at the end, the last three songs, Man on the Moon, Night Swimming and Find the River, I think that's up there with the best last three songs on an album of, you know, pretty much anything that you'll find. Superb album, definitely my top 10. Before we move on to the next album, I want you to tell me in the comments down below if there's any of these albums that you particularly would think about having in your top 10. Tell me a whole top 10, I'd love to see it. Or are there any of these albums that you absolutely can't stand and you can't figure out why on earth I've put it in there? Just ask me the question, or let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Next up, any fan of Britpop will tell you that this is a very important album in that genre. The debut album from Suede from 1993. So I felt when I first heard this album, when it first came out, it felt like it was the start of something, like something big was happening. And obviously that was the case for what followed over the next 3 or 4 years. A fantastic album, loads of great songs on there. I would sort of pick out, my favourites from there would be Animal Nitrate and Sleeping Pills, and that beautiful ballad at the end there, The Next Life, the piano ballad. Awesome album. Many people find the follow-up album Dogman Star to be better. Personally, this is the one for me when it comes to Suede. Fantastic. From 1994, I must be absolutely crazy not putting this in my top 3, but here we go. It's Oasis, Definitely Maybe, their debut album. Noel Gallagher had been stockpiling songs for the previous few years. Now, anybody who can put out a debut album that's got Rock and Roll Star, Live Forever, Supersonic, Cigarettes and Alcohol, Slide Away on it, you know that you're dealing with a major player, and Noel Gallagher for me is up there in the top 3 songwriters that this country has produced in the last 40 years, and this was a stunning debut album, and it really sort of paved the way for the career that they went on to have over the next few years. They changed the country, you know. Some bands change music, some bands change the country that they're in, and Oasis did that in the mid-90s, and that album was very important in doing that. Definitely Maybe. Definitely. Next up, it's them again. What's the Story? Morning Glory by Oasis, their second album from 1995. And if Definitely Maybe was the album that sort of set the groundwork for them to be a big band, this is the album that just lifted them off into the stratosphere. Just sensational songs. You'd think that he would have used up all his great songs on the first album, and then Noel comes up with Wonderwall, Don't Look Back in Anger, Some Might Say, Cast No Shadow, She's Electric, Morning Glory, Champagne Supernova. The man was a genius. But, you know, he wasn't the only genius in that band. They wouldn't have been what they were without Liam and just his amazing singing that he was doing at this time. Definitely Maybe, you know, it was a big album, but it was not in the same league as this in terms of the effect it would have on the country. You couldn't move in 1995 and 96 in Britain without seeing people who were influenced by what Oasis were doing at the time. And obviously the Nebworth concerts came off the back of this. I was lucky enough to be there, and it was just one of the biggest events in the country for so many years. I love Oasis. I'm not afraid to say it even all these years later. That is still an amazing album. Just a few weeks after What's the Story? Morning Glory came out, this came, Different Class by Pulp. It's just amazing. I put this as my #1 Britpop album in a video that I did a few months ago. There'll be a link if you want to have a look at that. Common People is one of my top 10 favourite songs of all time by anybody. Just absolute genius. And it's just great all the way through. So, you know, Pulp proved that they were not going to just be in the shadow of Oasis and Blur and those other big bands of the time. They were capable of doing something that was just as good, if not better, as what those bands were doing. Jarvis Cocker is a hero, and this album's fantastic. As great as those last albums were, I don't necessarily go back and listen to them that often, but I do with the next one, and that's Everything Must Go by Manic Street Preachers. I find it to just be a brilliant album to listen to all the way from start to finish, no matter how many times I've heard it before. For me, Manic Street Preachers, this is the pinnacle, I think, for me. Before this, I liked quite a bit of what they did, but I was never a fan of whole albums all the way through. And I think after this, I think they were past the peak. This is that pinnacle for me. It's just still 23 years later, a fantastic album to listen to on a regular basis. There's no weak link on this album, I don't think. Brilliant all the way through. So I've got one more album to look at before I go on to the top three. So they say that form is temporary and class is permanent. Proved on this album, Flaming Pie by Paul McCartney from 1997. So I know he had his ups and downs. As much of a McCartney fanboy as I am, not all albums are great of his. But with this one, this was his return to showing that he is the master when it comes to songwriting. So the few years before this, he'd spent an awful lot of time working on the Beatles anthology project. So he'd probably been in Beatle Paul mode a lot more in his mind just before this album was recorded than he had been since he was in the Beatles sort of 27 years earlier. And I just think that that spurred him to try and reach those highs again. And he's done that on this album with his songwriting for me. So I think there's several songs on here that stand up in terms of quality compared to anything that he put on a Beatles album. So songs like the song we were singing, Some Days, Calico Skies, Little Willow, those songs are as good as anything that he was putting out on Revolver or the White Album. And, you know, I'll argue that with anybody because the man was on fire with his songwriting here. It's a really nice laid back album as well. It's a good album to chill out to on an evening, and it really sort of started the next phase of his career that's sort of really been going on since, where the last 15 years or so, I think, have been absolutely vintage McCartney. And a lot of that, I think, stems to the confidence that he must have got from the quality that he put on this album. Absolutely brilliant. Flaming Pie. Okay, on to the top three. Not really in any particular order, but first of all, I'm going with The Bends by Radiohead. Now, there's hardly any albums ever that I find to be perfect, as in, there's nothing you could do to the album to make it any better than it already is. But I consider The Bends by Radiohead to be a perfect album. You could not improve this in any way. It's just great songs all the way through. It's not necessarily an album with a theme, or if it is a theme, it's a theme that's gone over my head and I've never known what that is. But it's just brilliant all the way through. And Tom York's voice on this, it's like an extra instrument, if you like. He's not just singing the songs, he's really sort of using his voice as an instrument through this. And I listen to this album so often still because I am never not going to enjoy listening to this. Fantastic. The Bends by Radiohead. Another of my top three albums of the decade is Achtung Baby by U2. Now, I had a really sort of weird history with U2. I was not a fan at all in the 1980s while they were getting big. In fact, I absolutely detested them. And it was only really when With or Without You got released as a single in, was it 87, from the Joshua Tree, and I just thought, yeah, I can't argue with that. That song is just so good, and I started to listen to them a bit at the time, and I really sort of enjoyed Rattle and Hum, started listening to the Joshua Tree a lot, and this really was my first U2 album that I looked forward to and was waiting for when it came out. So I've got a special place in my heart for this, and just from my point of view, the main thing I remember about this album was that I got chicken pox when this came out. I got chicken pox, I had 3 weeks off work, and I did pretty much nothing but put chamomile lotion on my chicken pox spots and listen to this album. And I got to know it so well and absolutely love it. And I've been a huge U2 fan ever since, really. There's one song on this album that I've never liked, and that's Who's Gonna Ride Your Wild Horses. Does nothing for me, but I've spoken to a lot of people who say that's my favourite song on the album. Well, brilliant. I'm glad for you. I'm glad you love it, but it just does nothing for me. Zoo Station, I remember the first time I played this album, and Zoo Station came on. I thought my speakers were broken. What the heck is going on here? I just wasn't ready for the sounds that U2 created on this album. It was just so different to everything that they'd done before. And they'd got a groove, they'd got a funk, and they sounded like they were really enjoying themselves on this album. And then when they were touring this, the Zoo TV tour was just astonishing. So that was the first time I saw them live at Round A Park in Leeds in 1993 in front of 95,000 people, performing songs from this album as well as loads of their other hits as well, and just one of the greatest nights of my life. So I'm always going to love this album. Absolute genius. So we've got one album left, and yeah, whilst I haven't necessarily got a top album of the 90s, I have left till last the one that I think is probably the best album that came out that decade. It's OK Computer by Radiohead. Now, I said that The Bends to me is a perfect album, and it's my favourite Radiohead album, but I think this is the best one. And I think there is I can qualify that difference in my own mind, I think. This is more of an album. It's more of a sort of a story from start to finish, even though there is no story really, but it just feels like more of a cohesive album to me, rather than The Bends, which is just a series of fantastic songs. It's crazy as this album. I don't necessarily understand a lot of it, but I love it at the same time. Even down to something like Fitter Happier on here, with the voice that's it's a little bit Stephen Hawking-esque. I love it. I don't know what he's on about. I don't understand it at all, but I think it's fantastic. Paranoid Android is it's like a Bohemian Rhapsody for the 1990s, in the way that all the different parts come together to make something that's fantastic. No Surprises is a beautiful song. Karma Police, which it sounds, it's the nearest thing they ever did to a Beatles song. It sort of reminds me of Karma Police. It is Karma Police. It reminds me of Sexy Sadie from the White Album, the Beatles. But there's a lot of people would say, and I would agree with them to an extent, when they say that this is the sort of last absolute classic album that was ever made. Now, I think classic albums have been made since, but I don't necessarily think there's been a better album than this made since. It's a work of genius. They went in other directions after this, some of which I love, some of which I've never quite been able to wrap my head around. But everything that they were building up to, from The Bends to this is just one of the great albums of all time, let alone the 90s. Absolutely love it. That's my album of the decade. I've said it. I didn't realise I had an album of the decade for the 90s, but I'm saying it, and I feel confident saying it. There you go. Album of the decade. So there we are, that's it. Thank you very much for watching my top albums of the 1990s. I will be back later on in the year with the 1980s, so please feel free to stick around, subscribe to my channel if you want to see that, the 70s and the 60s, and this decade, which I'll be doing right at the end of the decade. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again sometime. Bye bye.